Porn rewires your brain, not metaphorically, not as a warning label. Actually rewires it, and most men who've tried to quit, really tried, not just the "I'll stop after this one" kind of tried, already sense this is true. They feel it in the reaching, in the automatic nature of the habit, in the way quitting feels less like a decision and more like fighting gravity. Something deeper than choice is running. Something mechanical, but here's what almost no one explains. You don't need a science degree to understand what that something is. You don't need the vocabulary. You don't need the terminology. You need to understand the pattern. Because the pattern is visible, recognizable, and once you see it clearly, it stops being mysterious. It stops feeling like a personal flaw and starts looking like what it actually is. A system that got built, ran without your permission, and can be dismantled. That's what this is about. Not shame, not motivation, understanding. By the time this is over, you'll know exactly why it's hard to quit, what's happening when you try, what the actual recovery process looks like, and why that recovery is slower than you want but more real than you've been told. Let's start at the beginning. Not the beginning of the problem. The beginning of how the mind learns anything at all. Every human being operates on a learning pattern so ancient it predates civilization by orders of magnitude. Something happens. The body responds. A consequence follows. If the consequence is good, the pattern gets reinforced. If it's repeated enough, the pattern becomes automatic. This isn't complicated. It's how you learn to ride a bike. How do you learn the route to work? How every habit, good or bad, eventually stops requiring conscious effort and starts running on its own. The mind is a pattern machine. That's its primary genius. Recognize what works, repeat it, and eventually make it effortless. The problem isn't the system. The system is responsible for almost everything useful you do. The problem is what happens when the system encounters something it was never designed to encounter. Think about what porn actually delivers, stripped of all its other qualities. A visual trigger, then arousal, then release. The whole sequence compressed into minutes, available on demand, infinitely varied, and completely without consequence. The mind doesn't evaluate the moral quality of what you've done. It evaluates the reward. And by every metric the mind uses to determine whether something is worth repeating, that sequence registers as one of the highest value experiences available. This is the first thing to understand. The mind doesn't know you're sitting alone in front of a screen. It knows you encountered a trigger, you responded, and something significant happened. It files that sequence the way a navigator files a productive route. Worth remembering. Worth making easier next time. Every time it runs again, the path gets cleaner, more worn. What was once a deliberate sequence becomes reflex. What requires a decision begins to bypass the decision-making process entirely. Think of it as the difference between hiking through dense brush and walking a trail. First time through, you're cutting through resistance. 20 times through, the path practically pulls you forward. This is why simply deciding to stop doesn't work the way men expect it to. The path isn't a thought you can choose not to think. It's infrastructure. It's been built through use, and it will remain available through disuse, at least for a while. More on that later. But the path itself isn't the whole story. There's a second layer that makes everything worse. There's a principle built into almost every sensory system a human being has. The first time you encounter something, you feel it completely. The second time, slightly less. By the 10th time, the mind has categorized it, filed it, and moved most of its attention elsewhere. This isn't a defect, it's a feature. A system that responded with full intensity to everything it had already encountered would be useless, overwhelmed by the familiar, unable to prioritize. So the mind habituates. It turns down the volume on what it already knows to stay alert to what's new. Sit in a room with a ticking clock for 20 minutes and stop noticing it. Walk into a kitchen and stop smelling what you've been cooking. Drive a route you've driven 1,000 times and arrive with no memory of the journey. This is habituation. The mind protects its attention by quieting what it's already processed. Now run that same mechanism through the pattern we just described. First exposure, maximum signal. Everything is new. The response is total. The reward is enormous. The mind takes note. Second exposure, slightly less. Third, less again. The content that once produced a complete response begins producing a diminished one. The volume knob, left to the mind's natural calibration, is slowly being turned down. This is where most men assume they're doing something wrong. Why does the same thing feel like less? Why isn't it working the same way it used to? They don't recognize they're watching a mechanical process, the same process that makes a favorite song feel ordinary after 300 plays. The mind is adapting. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do. But here's where the specific nature of porn creates a trap. The habituation mechanism wasn't designed to handle. A ticking clock you habituate to stays a ticking clock. You don't seek out a louder, more complex clock to feel the ticking again. The drive isn't there, but the sequence we described earlier, trigger, arousal, release, reward, creates a drive to maintain the reward. And when the familiar content stops producing the former response, the mind has only one available solution: more. More novelty, more intensity, more extremity, not as a character flaw, not as a choice, as the logical output of a system trying to maintain a reward level that's been sliding. Watch it in practice, and the pattern is unmistakable. Men who start with one category drift to others. Men who are satisfied with brief sessions find themselves hours deep. Men who couldn't imagine being interested in certain content find themselves there, puzzled at their own presence. They didn't choose escalation. They followed the volume knob, turning it up to feel what used to come at lower settings. The content itself matters less than this. Whatever threshold used to trigger the full response is no longer enough. Something more will be needed, and that more has no natural ceiling because the ceiling was always the novelty, and novelty, by definition, keeps moving. This is the tolerance mechanism, and it explains one of the most confusing experiences men describe: how they ended up somewhere they never intended to go, watching something they never thought they'd watch. They weren't pursuing a destination. They were following a gradient. There's a third thing happening that's quieter than the first two, more subtle in its development, and more damaging to the actual life a man is trying to build. The mind doesn't just learn patterns in isolation. It learns associations. This word belongs with that image. This smell belongs with that memory. This situation belongs with that feeling. Every time two things appear together consistently, the mind begins to link them, until eventually one summons the other automatically. This is ordinary memory working ordinarily, but apply it to what we've described. Over months or years, arousal has been consistently paired with a specific set of conditions: a screen, a particular type of content, a particular physical position, a particular kind of isolation. The mind, doing its job, links those conditions to the arousal response. They become, in the mind's filing system, the appropriate context for arousal. Real intimacy is different in almost every way: different sensory experience, different emotional texture, different kind of presence required. It doesn't match the template, and because the mind routes arousal through a template that no longer includes real physical presence, real intimacy begins to feel like the wrong pathway, not wrong morally, just a different road than the one the mind has been trained to travel. Think of it as GPS recalculating. You've been driving one route so consistently that when you try to reach the same destination a different way, the system keeps redirecting you back. The other route exists. You can see it on the map, but the system has a strong opinion about which road to use. Men experience this as a preference, preferring the solo experience over the partnered one, or as performance, finding that real intimacy doesn't produce the same response that screens do. Or, as a comparison, the real person in front of them feels somehow less vivid than what they've been watching. They interpret these experiences as something wrong with the relationship, something wrong with the other person, something wrong with themselves. What's actually happening is association. The arousal pathway has been routed to a context that the real world can't replicate, and the real world has been gradually pushed out of that routing. The partner isn't failing to compete. They're competing on an uneven surface that the man built without realizing he was building it. This is the damage that's hardest to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it, and hardest to admit for someone who has. It's not about attraction. It's not about love. It's about conditioning, and it can be undone, but only if you understand what was actually built and what undoing it actually requires. Most men describe the habit this way: I didn't decide to. I just found myself doing it. That sentence is more precise than it sounds, because it points to something real. At some point in the development of this pattern, the pause between impulse and action stopped working. Normal decision-making runs a sequence. A thought or desire arises. There's a gap, a moment where evaluation can happen, where the person considers whether to act. Then action, if they choose it. The gap is small in some decisions, larger in others. But it exists. It's the space where choice lives. What happens when a pathway is used enough, rewarded enough, reinforced enough, is that the gap begins to compress. The impulse and the action move closer together. The evaluation step gets shorter. Eventually, for many men in the grip of a fully developed pattern, the gap disappears almost entirely. The impulse arrives, and the action is already underway. There's no space to choose otherwise. This is not a weakness. It's not a moral failing dressed up as a mechanical explanation. It is what happens when any behavior becomes automated. Athletes talk about muscle memory, the body performing complex sequences without conscious direction because the sequence has been practiced until it runs itself. This is the same mechanism, turned in the wrong direction. The man who finds himself watching things he didn't intend to watch isn't making a series of bad choices in the moment. The choice was made earlier, by the version of him who used the pathway often enough to automate it. The current version is watching the result of that earlier use. Understanding this matters enormously because it changes the strategy. If you believe the problem is weakness in the moment, your solution is willpower in the moment. And willpower in the moment is fighting a reflex with a thought, which is why that approach fails so consistently. The reflex is faster than the thought. It will win. If you understand a problem is a pathway that's been automated, your solution changes. You are not trying to out-decide the reflex. You're trying to interrupt its conditions, weaken its infrastructure, and rebuild the gap that used to exist between impulse and action. That's a different project, a longer one, but it's the actual project. Which brings us to the part most men want to skip to, and which only makes sense if you understand everything before it. Recovery isn't the same as stopping. This distinction matters more than almost anything else. Stopping is the absence of the behavior. Recovery is the dismantling of the infrastructure. They happen together, but they're not the same process. And conflating them is why so many men who stop for weeks still feel like something is wrong. Because they've stopped, but the infrastructure is still largely in place. The pathway weakens through disuse. This is as reliable as the fact that it's strengthened through use. What you don't repeat begins to fade. The worn trail, unwalked, begins to be reclaimed. This is not my metaphor. It's observable in every habitual behavior that's ever been successfully broken. The smoker who quits finds cigarettes less compelling over time, not immediately, in fact, not for a while. But consistently as the weeks become months, the pull diminishes. The difficulty is what happens in between, when a highly reinforced pathway is cut off. The system doesn't accept the interruption quietly. It treats it as an emergency. The impulse hits harder. The craving is more intense than the baseline habit ever was. Every possible argument for returning to the old pathway gets recruited. This is the withdrawal period. Not a dramatic medical event, but a mechanical one. The system is pushing back on the interruption with everything it has. This is the moment most recoveries fail, not because the man is weak, but because he interprets the increased intensity as evidence that he can't do this. He's more tempted than ever before, so he assumes he's getting worse. He's not. The increased pull is the system doing what systems do when their primary reward source is interrupted. It's a sign the recovery is working, not failing. If he holds through it, not perfectly but persistently, something begins to shift. The volume knob that was turned so far toward artificial stimulation slowly begins to recalibrate. What used to register as nothing, ordinary attraction, ordinary intimacy, the presence of a real person, starts to carry a signal again. Things that felt muted, underwhelming, like the wrong road on a GPS that kept demanding a U-turn, start to feel like the right road again. This is what some men call the flatline, followed by reemergence, a period of apparent numbness before a new baseline of sensitivity establishes itself. The GPS is recalculating, not because you made it, because you stopped driving the old route and waited for the new one to become familiar. The associations are rebuilt through new experiences, real intimacy, repeatedly chosen over the conditioned alternative. begins to lay down its own associations. The mind, pattern machine that it is, starts linking arousal to reality again. This doesn't happen in days. It often takes months before the rewiring feels substantially different. Men who expect to feel better in 2 weeks are setting themselves up for despair. Men who understand they're in a months-long process of infrastructure dismantling and rebuilding can tolerate the difficulty because they know what it is. The gap between impulse and action, the one that was eliminated by automation, returns. Not all at once. In fragments, at first. A moment where you notice the impulse before acting on it. Then a moment where you act differently once you've noticed it. Then, gradually, the reflex loses its automaticity because the pathway is no longer being maintained. This is what recovery actually looks like. Uneven, non-linear, slower than you want, more real than the version sold to men who expect transformation in 90 days. The infrastructure doesn't dismantle on a schedule. It dismantles through consistent disuse, through the patience to tolerate the system fighting back, through choosing the real over the condition long enough that the real becomes, again, the primary pathway. Here's what all of this adds up to, and why it matters. You're not broken. You're not uniquely weak. You're not fundamentally different from men who haven't developed this pattern. What you have is a set of pathways, built through repetition, maintained through use, automated through frequency, that are now running in ways that no longer serve you. The mind that built them is the same mind that will dismantle them. The process that created the problem, repetition, reinforcement, time, is the same process that reverses it. Understanding this does something shame never could. Shame asks, what's wrong with me? Understanding asks, what actually happened and what does fixing it actually require? What happened is mechanical. What's required is time, consistency, and a realistic picture of the recovery process, so that when it's hard, which it will be, you know you're fighting infrastructure and not character, so that when the intensity spikes in withdrawal, you recognize it as the system resisting, not evidence that you can't do this, so that when the real world feels muted and uninteresting at first, you know you're in the recalibration phase, not permanent damage. The machinery is visible now. You can see what was built, how it was built, and what dismantling it actually requires. That visibility is not a small thing. Most men fight this in the dark, against a force they don't understand, using strategies designed for a different kind of problem. Understanding what's actually happening doesn't win the fight by itself, but it puts you in a position where the fight can be won. The path back is real. The process is slower than you want. And it starts with exactly what you just did, understanding what you're dealing with.